So, hi everyone. Welcome to our second virtual information session for the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative, a program produced by, sponsored by, built by the American Enterprise Institute and the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. And its central mission is to recognize and try to develop solutions for the intellectual diversity problem in American higher education today. And so it's increasingly evident to many folks across the political spectrum, within universities and without, that on campus, regardless of political persuasions, there are intellectual and institutional consequences to having so few voices, from the center to the right to the heterodox in higher education. And so one of the ways we hope to broaden that range of voices through programs like the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative is to broaden the pipeline of students going into higher education programs like political science PhD programs or political theory PhD programs. And to that end, we hold a number of different types of events. We put on seminars like this, where we introduce students to questions like, what are quantitative methods in political science? How should you be prepared for them? Or to seminars on broader questions like, what is graduate school? What is it good for? What is it good for in this economy, maybe? And then a particular niche mentorship program, a boutique mentorship program for students who are actively applying this cycle for programs in political science, PhD programs in political science or political theory. In the future, we might expand to other disciplines, but so far GSIDI is mostly concentrated there. And in that process, we match students with budding research interests and active applications to PhD programs with mentors who are likely to have some expertise in areas where students want to learn and sharpen their teeth. So you might, if you're interested in quantitative methods in political science, you might be matched with somebody like Sean Westwood, whom we'll introduce a little bit later. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve Tellis and Jenna Story, who are the co-directors of the program. And then we'll jump into a conversation with Sean Westwood.
Yeah, I just wanted to start by, first of all, welcoming Sean and introducing him a little bit, and then talking a little bit about the general field of which Sean is in and the particular difficulties that might create for getting more diversity into academia. So, Sean is a proud graduate of Stanford University. He actually did his undergrad degree at University of Nevada. And he is an expert on political behavior, public opinion, and partisanship. He's extraordinarily, intimidatingly well published on those subjects, and is somebody who's cared a lot about getting more ideological diversity into higher education for a while. One thing I'll say about the general subject is that we just in our own networks, right? One thing we've discovered is among sort of people who are undergraduates or thinking about graduate school, there's already a fairly strong network in political theory, political philosophy of people who are thinking about graduate school. And so while there's a general problem of ideological diversity in recruitment into our profession, there's a particular problem in the areas where we are using the more advanced empirical methods, especially in American politics, but in other subfields as well. So this is why we thought it was important to have someone of the high esteem of Sean to come in and help us break it down, but also to help us understand why people who are of heterodox liberal center to the right shouldn't be afraid of more advanced methods, and that they may actually be a great way to study the kind of things that people care about. So before we start with Sean, Jenna, is there anything you wanted to add real quickly?
No, that sounds good, Steve. I guess I might just introduce Jacob, who is our executive director of this Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity Initiative and also a PhD candidate in history. And myself, I'm Jenna Story. I'm a senior fellow at AEI. I was a professor of political philosophy before coming to AEI in 2021.
So great. So Sean, I know, as one would imagine, has a incredibly slickly produced little presentation for us to get us into the conversation, and then we'll have a discussion of the issues that it raises. So, Sean, right now the floor is yours.
So I really appreciate this opportunity, and I want to make a strong sell to you all on why quantitative methods are necessary and important to our future as a discipline and to our future as a society. So I want to start today with a quote from Dr. Lauren Wright, who's a colleague of mine at Princeton, that I think really captures something important about the classroom dynamics that we see today. In my undergraduate and master's classes, I often notice the conservative students come prepared for battle. They do the reading because if they present an unpopular opinion or ask a question that challenges progressive ideas, they know they'll have to defend. Left-leaning students are more likely, in my experience, to float a half-baked idea or ground a statement in their personal experience or feelings about an issue. Right-leaning students don't believe they have enough goodwill to do that in a classroom setting, so they tend to have more measured and detailed arguments. So I think this observation is important because it highlights a real asymmetry in academic spaces. Conservative students feel that they need to come with evidence and rigorous arguments because they anticipate pushback. And liberal students, feeling that they're in a more sympathetic environment, may feel that they can rely more on personal experience or feelings. What I want to talk about today is how this connects to the broader reality of our discipline and why everyone, regardless of their political views, needs to be prepared with strong quantitative skills. So modern political science is quantitative, and I just want to say that that's not a normative judgment. I want to be quite clear that I'm not making a prescription of what is best for our discipline, but just an observation of where the field is. The data that I'm about to present describes where we are. So I want to also note something, which is that I want to echo, I suppose, what was said at the start of this, which is that there tend to be more conservatives in qualitative fields than in quantitative fields in political science. So we tend to have more conservatives in political theory than we do in American or comparative or international relations. So we are underrepresented in the fields of political science that set policy, that test policy, and often that engage with the media, which is why I think it's so important to build intellectual diversity in these subfields of political science. So let's just start with the job market, because ultimately that's what we're all training for, right? This chart shows a breakdown of political science job postings by subfield, and about 45% of jobs are in quantitative fields. 30% are in fields that have some mixture of quantitative or qualitative work, so I would argue are largely quantitative, and about 25% are in primarily qualitative fields. So the bottom line, I think, is that if you want to maximize opportunities in political science, you need quantitative training. Secondly, we look at what gets published, because this is what's going to shape what counts as legitimate scholarship in our discipline. We're going to find a similar pattern. These are submissions to the American Political Science Review, the top journal in the field of political science in the last 4 years or so. And again, I'm going to show you the same result. The overall breakdown here is, again, pretty striking. About 63% of submissions are in quantitative subfields, 22% are mixed, and about 15% are in qualitative fields. So practically, this means that the research that gets published, that gets cited, and that shapes our discipline's conversations is predominantly quantitative. And if you want to participate in those conversations, you need to be able to speak the language. Not surprisingly, the same is true for our funding. If we look at lifetime funding from the NSF, over 92% has gone to quantitative research in political science. Now, of course, the NSF is not the only funding source and may become a minimal funding source, but this pattern holds across private funders as well. So what does this mean for you? I think this means that if you want to write competitive grants, if you want to secure external funding for your research, which is increasingly important for career advancement, you almost certainly need quantitative skills. So the real point is that math and statistics have become our language, and they are what give us credibility as a field. I want to connect this back to where we started with Dr. Wright's observation about classroom dynamics. So here is a quote from influential, and what I would contend is a wrong book that offers a style of argument that is increasingly common in political science. So Republicans increasingly pursue outsized power and benefits for dominant social groups while working to undercut government by the people. The party has been overtaken by those who long for stricter racial hierarchies of the old white South, who envision a Christian theocracy, and who steer government benefits to the rich. By contrast, Democrats today are a pluralistic, multiracial party increasingly committed to advancing democracy through electoral representation and equal rights and liberties. Now, you might agree or disagree with the substance of these claims, but note what's happening here. These are sweeping empirical assertions presented without data. And if you read the rest of the book, there is not data to justify these claims. There's no quantitative support here. So this is what I would classify as data-resistant storytelling, arguments that sound sophisticated, but that aren't actually backed up by rigorous evidence. And the thing is, in our current academic environment, arguments like this are often accepted uncritically if they align with the monoculture or the dominant ideological perspective. So remember what Lauren is suggesting. Conservative students aren't always going to get this luxury. You will be challenged. So you have to be prepared with the best possible evidence. When you see a hollow argument, you're going to have to be prepared to respond with data and analysis. So the uncomfortable truth is that the system as it currently operates is going to be less skeptical of arguments that are oriented with a liberal worldview and perhaps more skeptical of arguments that are oriented with a conservative worldview. So the crucial point is that to counter this, you need to be trained to produce flawless evidence. Not just good evidence, but flawless estimates. Because if you challenge the prevailing consensus, whether you're a conservative challenging progressive orthodoxy or a progressive making an argument that goes against conventional liberal wisdom, you will be held to a higher standard. So you need to be able to use data to refute nonsense, and there's a lot of nonsense out there on all sides of the political spectrum. So sweeping claims without evidence or cherry-picked examples or anecdotes presented as data, you'll need to be able to fight against that. You'll need to be able to use data to win, not in the sense of manipulating data to support predetermined conclusions, but in the sense of building arguments so rigorous, so thoroughly documented, so methodologically sound that they can't be dismissed wholesale. And this is true regardless of your political views, but it's particularly true if you're going to be in the minority in academic spaces. So my sell to you is to learn the language that is used to set the debate and use that language to redefine or to push back against bad argumentation. So just to bring this full circle, you need to be prepared for quantitative research. You need to be ready to excel at quantitative research. But the good news here is that these are all learnable skills. Statistics, research methods, data analysis, they may feel intimidating, but with persistence and effort, they're easy to master. And when you do master them, you'll be able to participate fully in scholarly conversations, particularly the conversations that shape our field. You'll be able to make arguments that aren't easily dismissed, and you'll be able to hold your own regardless of the political environment. And I think that's exactly what this initiative is here to help prepare you to do. So with that, I'd love to continue the conversation.
That's great, Sean. So I wanted to start, you were sort of in part leaning into the challenge that's created by the current existing imbalance. But one thing I've often emphasized is that there's an arbitrage opportunity here, right? The fact
Yes.
that there's so little representation of people who are the center to the right, and especially these fields, means that there's lots of terrain that hasn't been turned over, whereas people on the left have already turned over those things, a lot. Can you give us a few examples of areas where you think there's lots of opportunity that hasn't been mined because, the people aren't quite prospecting for them and there because of ideological imbalance?
Sure. I think in the work that I do, there are a few things that come to mind. So first is the idea that Americans, by and large, are universally committed to democratic norms. That is just an observable truth. And that gives a lot of opportunity to try to explore, well, if that's the case, why are politicians so misaligned with what their constituents want? I think another good example of this is what is the role of government in setting trade policy. If you look at public opinion data now, it's the case that Democrats and Republicans, more or less, universally agree in free trade policy. So how do we reconcile that with the representation that they're receiving from government? And I suppose a final example is how should we think about the trade-off between identity politics and traditional economic messaging? And again, the data show quite clearly that the American public are not responsive by and large to identity politics, but they are extremely responsive to economic politics. How do we come to a place where messaging on the issues that Americans care about, the economy, became subordinate to messaging on, I guess, what you would consider to be niche arguments from the extremes? I think these are all questions where the data is clear, but where the argument might perhaps be unpopular and therefore not advanced. So I think you're exactly right. It is the case that it's really easy and probably boring to publish work that aligns with the dominant viewpoint, but it's more interesting, it's more exciting, and it's more likely to be important to the field if you're able to push back with high quality evidence. So by, I suppose, self-inflicted censorship, we have limited debate, and there are a lot of people who I think are willing and able to bring that debate forward to fill the gap that exists.
Just to push
I
this,
hope you are those people.
yeah, just to push this arbitrage point a little bit, in my book on the conservative legal movement, I
Mhm.
had a discussion of the people who were doing law and economics in the 60s and 70s. And, there was a period when people like, Richard Posner and people along those lines were just producing a gargantuan amount of scholarship. And I did some questions about it, and they said, look, we would just take our actually fairly rudimentary training in economics and just go to all the seminars of what people were doing already in law schools and just go back to our offices and write up all the fallacies that were
Yeah,
existing. And then you could get published in all of the top journals because there were so many obvious errors among the most prestigious scholarship, right? And again, I think that points to the fact that the areas where people's priors are not really pushed at, or where people don't necessarily have incentive to go into all the details of people's models, create a big opportunity. So a lot of what you were emphasizing, again, for people who are just coming into this, you're in generally what we describe as political behavior. So those are about citizen attitudes, public opinion, just in the field of American politics, but in some of these other fields as well. There's a lot of other things that people study where there are arguably large opportunities too. So do you want to tell me, at least outside of your own subfield, what are areas where you think that people who've got somewhat more dissident kind of views might find a lot of opportunity, not just in the public opinion area?
sure. So I think if we look at what our representatives do, if we look at understanding their ideological positions, we're in a world where some of the current data just doesn't make sense. The dominant model for understanding the ideological position of elected officials suggests that the squad are moderates. And that's kind of facially absurd. So there are real opportunities to, in the subfield of American institutions, really critically think about what does it mean to be liberal? What does it mean to be conservative? What does it mean to be a moderate? What are the effects of being moderate on election outcomes? And that's a part of the field where there have been a number of debates recently on whether you should be moderate or extreme if you want to win re-election. The position, kind of surprisingly to me in the subfield, is that you should be extreme in order to win re-election. You shouldn't appeal to the median voter. You shouldn't appeal to the moderate wings of both parties or to independents. That's a very strange argument. And if you poke at the evidence, it's even stranger. So just the basic questions, what is ideology? What kind of positions should a representative take in order to win re-election? Or what kind of position should a candidate take in order to be elected? Are really ripe with opportunities for a critical eye to come in and ask serious questions and answer those questions with data.
One thing I was going to say when I think about fields that are even a little further from what we talked about before. A couple of examples I always give of work that I think people who are on the center to right ought to be looking at as kind of models of what they can do are a lot of this new scholarship in local politics. So the
Mhm.
two of the examples I give is Michael Hartney is finishing a really interesting project on the politics of political decision making around COVID, and that gets into things like teachers unions and how they make their own decisions, and obviously that builds on work of people like Terry Moe, who've been very critical of that. Right, that's not the kind of work that people who mostly are center left are going to be super eager to do. And I always talk about this that we shouldn't imagine a world in which there's no motivated cognition. Motivated cognition is kind of unavoidable. What you want is a discipline as a whole where everybody's motivated cognition to some degree counteracts each other. The other example I was going to give is Sarah Anzia, who's at Berkeley, has done also great work on both public pensions and who
Mhm.
participates in local government. There's interesting work that's more ideologically a little ambiguous about zoning and who participates in housing decisions and how that aggregates up into our larger housing crisis. And the thing I would say is, mostly local government, at least local government of fairly large jurisdictions, is almost all run by Democrats, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's a real value. I think, as you were suggesting before, one of the things is the discipline needs people with more dissident views, right? They need people who actually, have a bee in their bonnet about how cities are run, because they're the people who are going to go out and produce some of that scholarship, who are going to go out and take some of their values and study things that other people are not. And so I guess I'm interested in, we've talked about political behavior, American sort of national institutions, local politics. Anything else that sort of occurs to you off the top of your head about areas of opportunity?
So I couldn't agree more. I think that if you're listening to public debates, the argument around abundance seems pretty common sense. But in academia, that's actually almost seen as right wing. So the critical mass is not going to do work that's going to test the assumptions of abundance. That's a huge opportunity. In terms of local politics, there's really great work that's come from Clayton Nall on NIMBYism and the housing crisis. To echo the work on COVID, Francis Lee at Princeton has written a terrifying book on how government overreach perverted our response to COVID-19. And then there's really great work coming from Tyler Simcoe on how school boards, which are probably the most local of our institutions, have now been taken over by national politics. So rather than debating how to fund the local high school, you now have school boards that are debating their response to Gaza, which I think is just a really important normative deviation from what we want from our school boards and something that you can use data to push back against. So at all levels of political science, at all levels of American politics, there are questions at what I suppose you would consider to be the center of the public, where the field has shied away or where the data and evidence have not been brought to bear on the important normative questions. And I think these are all huge opportunities for students who are willing to take serious questions seriously. It's really actually quite exciting about at the moment, it's really quite exciting the amount of data that we now have access to because of transparency initiatives, the amount of compute that we now have access to because of AI, and the new and exciting ways that we can address these long-standing questions with those new forms of data.
The one thing I noticed when I was looking at your some of the data that you had is while there's a lot of work that's quantitative, right? There's also a lot of this that's mixed methods.
Mhm.
Now, the naive reader of this may not know exactly what that looks like. I'll give a couple examples, and you might too, because again, I think that shows that having quantitative skills and being able to use them doesn't mean that's like everything you're going to be doing.
Yes, absolutely.
So, like just a couple of examples that occur off the top of my head. I'm a huge fan of Dan Carpenter's work at Harvard. His book Reputation and Power is one of my all-time favorite books, right? A lot of that is historical, archival. He, went into the archives of the FDA and drug companies and everything else. But there's also like really important points there. He uses quite advanced methods to test very
Yes.
discrete hypotheses. And at least in my sense, that's what seems like the real power, right? Is when you can actually use all of the methods that you need to really dig into something and understand it. So can you give me a couple of examples just from you of where
Sure.
people have used combinations of what you might think of as like historical or interpretive methods and quantitative methods?
Yeah, so I want to be clear. I think that quantitative methods are a powerful tool, but they're not the only tool, and they should never be the only tool. So in my own work, I find that it's often the case that you're going to identify patterns in the world by doing historical analysis, by reading what members of Congress are saying, by using uh, text analysis tools to try and summarize massive amounts of text. And then from that, to find testable questions that you can address with experiments or other forms of causal identification. So I think that the message isn't that quantitative work is the only way to answer questions, but it's that quantitative work is seen in many fields, is seen by many outsiders as better evidence, as stronger evidence. Now, there are a lot of normative debates that we could have on that, but I think that the best work really does often emerge where you have careful historical analysis that then leads to quantitative testing. And there are a number of really good examples of that. So Eitan Hirsch has done this in his recent books. Gabe Lenz is famous for doing this. Francis Lee has a long history of doing this. In my own analysis, I think in the last several years, I've probably written 4 or 5 papers that start with, well, what do we actually see elected officials doing and saying? And then how can we formalize that into an analytic model? So it is going to be the case that quantitative work is not going to push away qualitative historical analysis, but it's a way of making that qualitative and historical analysis potentially more compelling to an audience that wants hard numbers, statistics, and estimates.
Yeah, and so I guess I would say that another way to think about this combination is that often actually experience is very, I mean, when you think about how do people generate hypotheses that then they test with more advanced methods, that often comes out of experience, intuition, other kinds of things. And while it might end with something very rigorous and quantitative, the experiences that you have that give you a hunch about where the thing to look at is really important. So I was talking to somebody who studies Congress who actually served under a Republican member of Congress before. And this person was absolutely effusive, even though he's a person who uses extremely advanced methods, about how important that sort of intuitive knowledge from experience was. And that's another thing where, again, why I think diversity is often important is that's going to introduce different of those intuitions that then people are going to be testing. And then the other thing I was going to say on this is mechanisms, right? That is,
Mhm.
once we've established a kind of statistical regularity, figuring out exactly what's causing that regularity, getting inside, if you've got something about, agency behavior or something, right? You've got a whole bunch of data for administrative data which is people are using a lot, right? That's not necessarily going to tell you exactly what's causing that relationship. It's going to tell you the relationship's there, but often you need to combine that with like really good qualitative, ethnographic, other kinds of things that help you understand what's going on inside of the black box. And that's again where, when you're trying to imagine what a career looks like in political science, it may be a combination of using or being on teams, right? One thing we know now is lots of papers, if you just look at it in the major journals, they don't just have a single author. They've got 4 or 5. Mostly we're not like epidemiological journals where they have 32 authors on their papers or whatever. But that's also kind of what it looks like to do that kind of work. And since Jacob's on here, right, again, the thing I would say is there's also people who are combining historical kinds of approaches, which often involve collecting lots of data, or they're converting work from archival sources into quantitative. data. Those are the kind of things that people are doing.
So I will say, I think some of my most famous results come from analysis that I started because I observed a pattern in the world that I wanted to understand. So I observed that people were unfriending because of partisanship. They were discriminating because of partisanship in my own social circles. And I wanted to understand how prevalent is that as a behavior in the United States, or how many people are willing to treat partisanship as a true source of division. So I ran a number of experiments. I did a lot of data collection and wrote some papers that tried to answer that question. In other work, I wanted to understand why people perceive elected officials as so conflictual. So if you turn on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, you're going to see incredibly aggressive and conflictual behavior coming from a subset of elected officials. And the question really is that what our representatives do day to day? Like, how prevalent is that in what happens in town halls or in DC or in constituent communication? So I collected everything that federal and state elected officials say. So their press releases, their tweets, their floor speeches, their newsletters. And it really turns out that there are about 30 representatives who have made conflict their brand, but that's not the modal representative. And really what we're seeing is that if you are a representative and you show up to DC and you do your job, that's not quotable. That's not going to get you on cable news. That's not going to get you a really popular X post, right? But if you do something aggressive, if you do something that pushes back against the norms of civility, that is going to get you that attention. So from trying to understand where this conflict was coming from, that led to a project where I now show that it's really not the dominant strategy. It's a strategy that is employed by those who really don't have anything else going for them. It's employed by those who don't raise a lot of money, who don't have a strong policy background, who don't have a strong policy team. And if they weren't aggressive, wouldn't have any media attention whatsoever. So the best thing that I could suggest to someone who's trying to think of a research agenda or to think about a research question is to look at the world and find claims that don't make sense to you, to find claims that don't align with what you're seeing in the real world.
Jacob?
Yeah, this is great. And so this last question is about like how our intuitions and experiences can shape our research questions. I guess I want to drill down, and I'm curious for what you would recommend, Sean, for students who are bought in, right? They've listened to the first 30 minutes of the talk. They want to speak the lingua franca of political science. Where should they start if they're coming from like almost, let's say, like zero level of training?
Sure.
Where might they build on training if they have some, right? Maybe they took a political science class or statistics minor, or imagine some like variation of undergrad degree, right, where they have maybe some statistics. And then where would you recommend that students who are maybe post grad in a professional phase, so maybe AEI research intern, for example, or AEI RA, right? Like, what can they be doing once they're outside of the university classroom to start building the capacities that we're suggesting are key to political science? So I'm curious if you could give a few takes across that spectrum of where students might be coming from in the actual nuts and bolts training.
For sure. So the advice that I give to any student who comes to my office who wants to be a political scientist is to take as many math classes as you possibly can. Take calculus, take linear algebra, take classes in probability and statistics. So at the moment, if you're admitted to a PhD program in political science, you will start with a 2-week intensive program called Math Camp that compresses calculus and linear algebra into about 2 weeks, right? So the more prepared you are from a mathematical perspective, the easier that transition to studying methods, to studying political science will be. And it is actually the case that I want to emphasize this, that math camp is required for everyone. So even if you want to be a political theorist, even if you want to study international relations from a qualitative perspective, the expectation is that you will complete the math camp and you will complete the following method sequence. So it sounds kind of strange for me to say if you want to study politics, study integrals, but it really is the truth. The more math that you can get under your belt, the better off you're going to be. And it's when I have pre-docs here, they have the opportunity to take a course on campus. And I tell them, take linear algebra, take calculus. If you're in a professional setting, there are math classes that you can take for free online. I would encourage that. That's not, you know, something you feel comfortable with, if you really do want to build up other skills, learn how to use statistical software. Learn how to use R. So R is the tool that most political scientists use for data analysis. It's got a huge infrastructure online that you can use to help build up your skills. There are free classes, there are data sets, there are free books. Spend some time familiarizing yourself with the statistical software that we use in the discipline. But if you're in a professionalized setting, I think the best thing that you can do is to demonstrate your openness to learning skills. So if you don't have a math background, that's not critical. That's not going to make you unacceptable to a political science program, so long as you commit to learning those skills. So the more that you can do to demonstrate an openness to building your toolkit, whether that be statistically or methodologically or in terms of math, the better off you're going to be. So just show evidence that you're not going to struggle with the methods requirement. The best way to do that is to demonstrate that you understand what political science research actually looks like, and you understand the commitments that will come from admission to a PhD program.
Yeah, I was just going to use the example you mentioned, Frances Lee, who's at Princeton, right? She's at the pinnacle of our prestige hierarchy, right? She is
And a great person, a fantastic
a
person.
fantastic person. Not necessarily, a lot of her work is actually more historical.
Mhm.
There's interviews, there's institutional, right? So, that's a large part of her palette, right? But her palette also has at least some like ability to complement that with more quantitative kind of work. And so just to say, right, there's a range of kind of stuff that people are doing from, people who are almost, completely methodologists. They're basically mathematicians, embedded into political science departments, and people who got just enough of this that they can actually communicate with people doing more advanced methods. And so it's not, this is not a bimodal like, variable, right? You often need even just a little bit that complements other kinds of methods can make a really big difference. Jenna?
I think it's also a huge opportunity because there are a lot of very influential senior scholars who have the background in historical analysis, who have the background in the law or in the administration of government, who now want to do quantitative work. And it's often the case that they do that by co-authoring and collaborating with PhD students. Um, Frances Lee works with Jim Curry, was one of her students, who's a very strong methodologist. If you come with these tools, there is an opportunity for you to build relationships with very influential faculty who want to leverage your skills to make strong arguments. So it's not just the case that you're building a platform for your own work, but you're building credentials that will help you form relationships with faculty who are going to be quite pivotal in letter writing and in helping you secure publication jobs. So it's not meant, I don't mean to terrify, I don't mean to overstate the role of math. I just mean to say that the reality is that there is this kind of hurdle at the very start of a PhD program. And the more you can prepare for it, the more practice you come in with, the easier it will be to run the gauntlet.
Jenna?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Sean. This has been extremely helpful, informative presentation. I want to ask you about you've emphasized the opportunities that conservative students may have in coming to political science with some new questions and perspectives, but it also poses a challenge, it seems. Like if these questions and perspectives were seen as naturally part of the field, then we wouldn't be launching this initiative to try to help them enter the field. So
Sure.
How would you suggest that a student at the phase of applying to graduate school approach this environment, right? How would, if you had said very nicely that a good way to find a question that you might want to investigate for your dissertation or for your future research is to look for claims that don't align with what you see in the real world. In other words, match up the existing claims in the research, with things that you are observing in your daily life or professional life, and sort of point out the potential disjunction. But if what you're seeing from your perspective is not aligning with current data, how would you make your way into that field where that data is accepted as the standards for the discipline?
So I will say that there are a limited number of scholars who I think would identify as conservative or as center right, but there's a very large subset of the field that is willing to help those who are trying to make conservative arguments or arguments from the center right. I think this initiative, in fact, has a large number of very influential faculty who probably would not place themselves on the right. So the challenge isn't, I think, getting credibility or recognition within PhD programs. Being able to leverage the arguments and evidence that you find to try and change the narrative in the field. There's a lot of appetite for conservative argumentation. There's a lot of appetite for liberal argumentation. There's just an appetite for good evidence. The challenge is going to be, I think, trying to redirect a monolithic field to a new equilibrium, to a new kind of center of gravity. And that may be a really hard ask. But maybe the best that we can do is introduce high quality evidence that shifts things slightly back towards where reality might actually live. So I suppose my argument, my suggestion is, don't assume that you're going to be isolated. Don't assume that it's going to be impossible to do this analysis, and don't assume that you'll be dismissed because of your argumentation. Like, that may happen, but that's going to happen to everyone, right? Like, everyone has a pet theory that they don't want to see proven wrong. That's just the nature of how academia works. So yeah, it's going to be hard, but it's always hard to change the center of gravity. It's always hard to change the dominant narrative. You will find support. You will find infrastructure. You will find faculty who will help you. So come in with your own ideas of what you might want to explore, but also identify faculty who you think are working in that area. Identify faculty that you think could reasonably help guide you on that project. Reach out to them. They, more often than not, will be incredibly helpful, and more often than not, will tell you exactly what they think on the issue, and more often than not, will point you to reading that you might want to do in order to better prepare your argument. Don't be scared to reach out to faculty. Don't be scared to reach out to faculty who may have written work that disagrees with your viewpoint. I think if we're doing our job effectively, our interactions with students should be entirely disconnected from our own political views. And I will tell you that there are a lot of faculty who are very good at doing that. So yes, have the methodological skills. Yes, have interesting questions, but also try to build relationships that are going to help you get your foot in the door. Build relationships to faculty who might be able to guide you through the process, especially if you're no longer in academia, if you're no longer an undergraduate. The more that you can signal your interest by building up connections to faculty, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, just to reinforce a couple of things that Sean said. One, and again, you can see by the list of people who are associated with this initiative, I am positive that most of them, in fact, are not conservative, and neither am I. But we're eager to work with people who come in with those priors. And one of the advantages of working with the initiative is it'll help you a little bit sort through that which is not going to be immediately obvious, right? The few people who are like visibly conservative are just the very tip of the iceberg, right? And there's lots of people underneath there who want to work with you. The other thing to say on this is, some of these more empirical fields are, in a way, more open to more dissident views because the means for falsifying some of the existing claims are slightly more straightforward than they may be in more historical and qualitative or theoretical fields. So some of that, I think there's a little more openness in that. But the last thing I'll say is, if you're going to graduate school, if you're going to submit yourself to the regime of that kind of training, you do need to be open in the fact that you, in fact, might be wrong, right? So the purpose of going to grad school and becoming a social scientist is not just to say, I'm going to go and find the evidence for the thing I believe, right? All of us have to be, the New Republic used to describe its philosophy as surprisability, right? That is, that the world isn't always what we suspect it's going to be. And that's one of, that kind of vulnerability is part of what's great about social science, right? Is that, we make hypotheses, we call them hypotheses, right? And then we submit them to the best kind of tests we can. And sometimes we find the things that we believe aren't right. And that's hard, but it's also, I think, really valuable. So that's one thing I would say just about that in general.
No, and that's exactly right. I will contend that political theorists are actually probably, on average, much smarter than I am because they have to make analytical arguments. They have to make claims that are reasoned through just massive amounts of legacy literature in a way that, as a quantitative scholar, I'm perhaps less bound by. Because if I collect data and I run a statistical test and it comes to a conclusion, that's the evidence, right? I don't have to worry about what Rousseau argued or how that might conflict with Enlightenment thinkers. I'm bound by the data. And that, in many ways, is quite freeing because the standard of evidence is codified in advance. But as I guess, as you just pointed out, that also means that you have to be willing to be wrong. And I think that I'm wrong a lot. Most political scientists are wrong a lot. The best political scientists will admit that. So our goal is not to come in with a narrative or to tell a story without condition. Our goal, I think, should be to come in with a problem or a question that we want to explore and where we might perceive substantial evidence from our own experience, and then to develop tests that we can run and that we can rely on to determine whether or not we were right or if we were wrong.
Yeah, maybe on this point, Sean, this is a kind of a cheery note on optimism of potential change within political science. And I guess one way to maybe bring it down in a final question for the students to the level of PhD applications. So we've talked a lot about skills that need to be acquired, some of the methods to acquire them, some of the ways to think about shifting paradigms of the fields with methods. I really like this last exchange about quantitative methods as potentially, sort of you can't assemble the master's house without the master's tools kind of thing, right? And so I'm curious though, like, how do you start signaling these things? What do you look for as somebody who supervises students coming in with interests in learning or pursuing quantitative questions? What do you look for in the applications, right? So what, for a student who's, again, like bought into all the things we've described so far, what are marquees of a really good research statement for somebody wanting to come to a program where they can learn these methods? And that'll be something the students can take away from the end of this call and go and tweak their statements before they need to submit in the next few months here, or weeks rather.
For sure. So I think one thing that I want to emphasize is that I'm the most pessimistic person you'll ever meet. I think everything is awful all the time, but even I'm optimistic here. I do think that the opportunities are really quite large. I think there's an appetite for intellectual curiosity and for viewpoint diversity. If I were thinking about applying to a PhD program, and if I were, I guess, in the position that many listening to this call might be in, I would be optimistic. There is a real appetite to allow diverse views to flourish. So to directly answer your question, I think the biggest mistake that you could make is to say, I want to learn causal inference, or I want to learn quantitative methods, full stop. Because that's not appealing, right? Anyone could learn or want to learn these things. I think what you want to suggest is that you want to learn these methods in service of answering important questions. So it's not enough to just say that you want these skills. You have to demonstrate that you want these skills and that you're going to apply them to important issues facing the Republic or important issues facing the discipline. So if you're interested in a specific method, enumerate that, but connect it to the argument that you want to test, or connect it to the analysis or the theory that you have. I also think that it's really important to use your research design or your research questions to bridge relationships to current faculty at the institutions that you're applying to. So in your statement, and I know that it's a lot of work, but in your statement, at least at a minimum, I would have a couple of sentences describing how your research questions connect to the methodological and empirical expertise of the faculty at the program that you're applying to. And don't just list names, right? Like, don't just say, I want to work with Dr. Westwood. Say, I want to work with Dr. Westwood because I read his work on political violence and I want to extend that analysis to understanding domestic terrorism in the United States. So this isn't an opportunity to just name drop. This is an opportunity for you to make yourself stand out. Because the reality is when admissions committees meet, it's going to be a subset of the faculty. And in most departments, if someone says that they want to work with Dr. Story, they'll send an email, hey, I have this application here. It seems good to us. What do you think? Right? And if you're able to make a more sophisticated connection to the line of research that underpins that faculty member's work, the better off you're going to be. There's, I think, also a need to demonstrate that you have thought a lot about what it means to be a political scientist, right? So you've thought about the fact that you're going to have to produce work. You're going to have to produce written output. So the more that you can do to convince the committee that this isn't just you dipping your toe into political science, the more you can convince the committee that this is you trying to be a political scientist, to be an active political scientist, the better off you are. It really is the case today that graduate students will publish very early in your first few years in the program. That should be something that you're signaling commitment to in your application letter. This is an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you work very hard, that you want to learn a lot, and that you have done your homework on the programs that you're applying to.
Yeah, just to piggyback a little bit on that, I was thinking there's sort of three things you probably want to signal. Right? One is imagination, which I think is a really hard thing to quantify, right? Exactly what that is, but like your ability, and that comes from lots of things. Sometimes that comes from bringing stuff from areas that people don't usually use into a new field, right? So often, if you just go back to the example of Dan Carpenter started University of Chicago PhD program as a political theorist. I started out as a political theorist, and even though I realized at best I'd be a B plus political theorist, which is definitely not what the world needs anymore of. That sort of, I think, greater sort of normative and historical sophistication has helped me in the kind of empirical work that I've done. Second, right, is something of a knowledge of how people have argued about these things. And that's when you mention, and including the people who you're talking about studying with. I often say that, people often joke about prison conversation between inmates where they've told the same joke so many times and somebody just says 48 and they, ha, 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 ha. A lot of academic arguments are like that when people are like talking about political violence or polarization, they might as well just say 72 but so you want to show that you're aware of the sort of history of people arguing and how you're thinking about fitting into it, including and why you want to study there. And then, right, what are the chops that you're going to bring to that? And those are varied, right? Some of those are going to be quantitative and some of them are going to be modeling. Some of them are going to be historical, right? And a lot of especially because of what Sean was saying about co-authoring, a lot of when they're looking at admitting students, they're thinking about admitting future co-authors, right? So that's often the way to sort of signal that is to say, oh, when they look at that, and they're like, oh, I can imagine going in with that guy, right? And I'll just use the example. My former, associate director of my center at Hopkins, Glory Liu, went to Stanford as a political theorist, a historical political theorist. She actually had to take the quantitative sequence at Stanford. And she said that was really valuable, but she actually ended up doing co-authoring with some of the more traditionally, more quantitative, more scientific kind of faculty at Stanford. So you shouldn't necessarily think about any of this stuff as all mutually exclusive. And I think a lot of the people who do the best work combine, some of these different kind of elements.
I guess one last bit of advice that I would give is to be humble. So you certainly want to sound appealing. You certainly want to sound like you have a clear vision of who you are intellectually. But it's also quite important, as I guess we were just discussing, it's really important to signal that you're going to be a good co-author, that you're going to be a good member of the cohort, that you're going to contribute respectfully, you're going to contribute meaningfully, and that you're going to take being a PhD student seriously, right? It's a job. I think that's the thing that maybe is hardest for PhD students to appreciate. It's the case that when you were an undergraduate, you were studying. I think when you're a PhD student, you're a professional, right? You're part of the discipline. It's no longer the case that you're just a student. And the more that you can signal that you bring the package, the full package of intellect, curiosity, and humility, the better off you're going to be. And that's advice for, I think, everyone appealing to a PhD program. Um, I guess the last thing I would suggest, and I said that the last thing I was going to say was the last thing, but it's also really important to strategically think about who your letter writers are going to be. Have conversations with them. Have conversations about what you're interested in. Have conversations about where you want to go. It might be daunting to reach out to a faculty member, but the more you can give them to work from, the more foundation that you give them to build upon, the better their letter for you is going to be. So if you're committed to being a graduate student, if you're committed to entering a PhD program, start building those relationships with faculty as soon as possible. It's not enough to just be great in a class. That's certainly something that I look for when I'm writing a letter of recommendation. But I really need to know how you think, who you are, and what you want to do. And that's the kind of thing I'm only going to learn if you come to my office, or if you send me emails, or if we iterate on your work. So just be well-rounded, and you'll be fine.
All right, Jacob, I think that we've covered it all. We've gotten every bit of knowledge out of Sean's head. We extracted it right out of there. I want to.
I'm done. I'm empty now.
You're done. Exactly. He's the null set now. So, Sean, I want to thank you a lot. Jacob, do you have any last words before we finish up?
No, thank you to the listeners. This is great. Thank you so much, Sean. And yeah, please just be in touch with us. Ping us at the emails listed on the Graduate Student Intellectual Diversity website. Listserv, ping us, sign up for the forms, and you can email me directly at jbrugge2@jhu.edu to talk any more about this. So yeah, thank you so much for Sean and to the listeners in posterity and the few we've had with us today who are interested in quantitative methods in political science.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean.